Welcome everyone here in the room and online. We're having a nice visit in the room. So I urge you to come next time and join us in the room in person, but we're glad you're here anyway. It's really delighted today to welcome our speakers, and this is a webinar, so if you have questions throughout, we have several people monitoring the Q&A, and you just drop your questions into the Q&A, and we'll just assume that we'll answer them at the end, but if there's one that's about to something technical or needs a clarification, we'll interrupt. But otherwise we'll take the questions at the end. I'm really delighted to welcome our presenter today, Phil Neff, who is a research coordinator, project manager for this project, and has been working on it for some time and knows everything in and out about the whole project. Professor Angelina Godoy, who's a professor in Law Societies of Justice and in the Jackson School, and a colleague of mine who's picked up this subject and really carried it to important outcomes. And Maria Vignal-Loria, who is online and a graduate student, ABD in sociology, who has also been working on the project. We're really delighted too that Trung An Wen and Jun Yang are here, probably online. I don't know if they're online. Yes. And we're delighted to have them here as well, and looking forward to his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to say a few words about the project, in particular to say, to hopefully express to all of you how grateful I am, we are as a team, to have this opportunity to engage with the CSD community. So I'm the director of the Center for Human Rights. And for those of you not familiar with our center, we were created just over 10, 12 years ago by an initiative of the Washington State Legislature, which tasked the University of Washington with creating research partnerships between researchers, students, faculty, and staff at the University of Washington and off-campus organizations, whether here in the Puget Sound area or anywhere in the world, that are working for real-world improvements in human rights. One of the areas we've been working on since our creation has been immigrant rights. And this project actually comes to us, I'll just say very briefly, the reason why we took this on. We work both with local partners and, as I mentioned before, partners around the world, but on immigrant rights issues, we've been particularly engaged with folks here locally, including La Resistencia, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and a whole coalition of other organizations who have been campaigning for years now to try to shut down the Northwest Detention Center in our backyard in Tacoma due to the human rights abuses that happen there on the regular. One of the common questions that this work generates, and so for example, there's bills right now before the Washington State Legislature that are involved in that effort. And one of the questions that advocates get is, well, but if we shut down this one facility, won't the people who are detained there or the people who are apprehended in our local area just get shipped to another detention facility, because we know that ICE has so many across the country? And it's a legitimate question. Advocates have found that in places where there have been facilities shut down, that they've seen anecdotal evidence anyway of a dip in enforcement patterns locally. And that's an important thing to bring forward to any jurisdiction that's potentially considering a shutdown initiative. But what we were asked to do, and what we've sort of the task we've taken on, is trying to measure that more systematically so that we could perhaps even get to the point of something like a prediction. Like, if we were to shut down the facility in Tacoma, what would we expect to see in terms of local enforcement efforts? How would our community's experience of ICE and immigration enforcement change? So that may sound like a simple question, but it's turned out to be extraordinarily complex. And at least I'm trained as a sociologist, but the methodological tools that our team has brought to bear on that question are very complex. And that's why we're really excited to be able to share with you what we're working on, and most in particular to receive feedback from all of you who have deep expertise in these complex methodological questions and tools. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado from me, I think I'm going to pass it to Maria
on Zoom. Thank you. Can everybody hear me in the room as well? Cool. So thank you, Angelina, and thank you, CSE, for the opportunity to present. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context and background of this project related to what Angelina was saying. So as some of you know, the U.S. immigrant detention system has grown dramatically in the past 2 decades. And research has shown that detention is not only ineffective at deterring migration, it also represents a grave threat to the well-being of immigrants, their families, their communities on many different outcomes, right? Now, as Angelina was saying, advocates and scholars alike argue that due to perverse financial and political incentives built into the detention system, rather than immigration enforcement driving a need for detention, it may be that detention drives a need for enforcement. So for example, federal bills have mandated DHS to maintain a steadily mounting number of detention beds in order to receive funding since 2009. And then inclusion of guaranteed minimum beds at local level has happened as well. And so while these assumptions have never been subjected to rigorous empirical scrutiny, there are studies that have surfaced some evidence of these mechanisms.
Rhea, we can't hear you.
Oh, did I mute?
Yes.
Sorry. I think, yeah, I was talking about our research question, sorry. So our question is, how do changes in US immigration detention capacity influence interior immigration enforcement in the surrounding region? And what can we expect to happen to enforcement rates if a detention center closes or it expands? And our specific hypothesis, sort of like derived from this question, is that an increase in available detention beds will be associated with increased arrests in the surrounding region, and conversely, a decrease in available detention beds will be associated with decreased arrests. And now I'll pass it back to Phil.
Thanks, Rhea. Yeah, so I'm going to speak to the process of putting together the data that we're analyzing. This has been a process that's taken place over multiple years, and every single step in this process has pushed our understanding and technical abilities to the max. So we really appreciate your questions, comments, feedback, concerns. We've assembled a nationwide data set of ICE enforcement actions, detention population, detention facility characteristics, demographic information, and other data in a monthly panel data that covers the period from fiscal year 2016 through midway through calendar year 2019. First, I'm going to, before talking about the individual data sets, I'm going to introduce the geographic unit that is our unit of analysis. Rather than county or state, which other researchers have used, we're using the AOR, the ICE area of responsibility, which is a ICE administrative unit that can be multi-state. So for example, the Seattle AOR covers Alaska, Washington, and Oregon, or they can be sub-state units. So for example, California, Texas, and New York all have more than one area of responsibility. And I'll get into part of the reason for this is data limitations. Another reason is that we understand that ICE field offices and the AORs exercise at least some degree of autonomy over detention and enforcement decisions in those areas. So the first data set that I'll talk about is ICE enforcement data. This is a data set that UOCHR obtained via FOIA, which covers, it's our most temporally limited data set. It's the one that restricts sort of our window for modeling. It also has a major problem with lacking precise arrest location. So for example, there's an apprehension landmark field, which will include values, many values with this format of a 3-digit field office code, general area, non-specific. And so for example, SNA, that's the San Antonio field office, 47% of apprehension landmarks in that area of responsibility have these really generic apprehension landmarks. And our analysis of records from the Seattle AOR suggests that those linked to specific field offices could cover multiple counties, if not multiple states. So to decode SNA general area as San Antonio proper, for example, is imposing quite a bit of specificity on the data that we're wary of. So we're going to breeze through a lot of the charts and tables in this, and we can come back to them for reference. Just a quick glimpse of national ICE enforcement trends. The main thing we see is sort of a change in level at the beginning of the Trump administration, particularly for arrests and encounters. But arrests are the variable that we end up using, that we focus on most. You'll see there's the least variation in monthly arrest totals compared to the other variables. But there is still quite a degree of variation between areas of responsibility in terms of arrest totals and the other variables. And one of the things I would point out here is that the areas of responsibility have very different characteristics within the detention and deportation system. So there are some, like San Antonio has an extremely high rate of, it's a deportation platform nationwide, compared to other areas of responsibility that don't have a major role in removals, deportations, but do arrests and detention. The next data set is of individual detention placement records per person per facility from fiscal year 2012. That was provided to us thanks to David Hausman and ASCLU California. The major problem with this data set is that it lacks individual identifiers for the people for detained people. So there are issues with deduplication and we also don't have information identifying the arresting agency responsible for the person's detention, which would be a useful data point to have that other researchers have been able to get in this format. We use this to generate midnight daily head counts per facility, and then also monthly average detained population, ADP, which is a figure that ICE uses and reports internally. And so this is just not expected to get much from this spaghetti plot here, but I would point out, for example, at the very end of the timeline, New Orleans AOR overtakes San Antonio AOR as the area of responsibility with the highest average daily population. We can also zoom in at the facility level and in specific areas of responsibility. So, for example, in Seattle area of responsibility, you see the example of a region dominated by one single detention facility, which is the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. The next data set is a set of detention facility characteristics and aggregate statistics from the National Immigrant Justice Center in 2017. This is the most detailed set of facility characteristics that we've seen. And it includes a lot of interesting information, including facility capacity, whether there are guaranteed minimum beds. So, for example, the facility operator gets paid for those beds, whether or not they're filled with detained people or not, and some other characteristics. There's just under 800 ICE detention facilities in this data set, excluding family, juvenile, and child detention facilities. The major problem with this is that many facilities do not have a set ICE capacity. They're used in an as-needed capacity. And so that becomes a problem for us when we try to calculate what is the overall detention capacity. And Maria will talk about that next. We do, however, know the capacity for the facilities that hold the majority of the detained population at any given time, between a third and a half of the detained populations in facilities. We do know the specific capacity. Most facilities are small, have a low average daily population and a low historic maximum population, and then there are few large facilities. And then Maria is going to talk about our use of demographic.
Thanks, Phil. So at this stage of our project, the demographic information that we're interested in includes the total adult population at the AOR, as well as information on the size of the adult immigrant population, including the total foreign-born, total non-citizen population, and then an estimation of the likely or potentially undocumented population. In the future, we might want to pull more information that will allow us to explore other contextual features at the AOR. But for now, this is what we have. And all of these estimates come from the ACS. We obtain them via tidy census, and then we aggregate it to the AOR level. And then for the potentially or likely undocumented estimation, we use the logical imputation method, which has been used by many other researchers to estimate the size of the undocumented population. We have some graphs that sort of like show this descriptively. Our first graph is for the adult population at the AOR level in 2019. And here, the important thing is to see the variation, right? There are AORs like Chicago, which is one of the most populated, and then we have San Diego or El Paso AORs that are relatively small population-wise, like adult population, yeah. And then our next graph is the immigrant indicator, foreign-born, non-citizen, and potentially or likely undocumented. And again, we see wide variation across AORs, with the Los Angeles one being one of the highest, at least for foreign-born and non-citizen. And I think I'll turn it back to Phil.
Yeah, so the final data set that we've tried to incorporate is a data set of aggregate statistics of Border Patrol encounters per Border Patrol sector from fiscal year 2000. And this would be an important variable to take into account because Border Patrol arrests are a major driver of the detained population. People arrested by CBP or Border Patrol at many times account for the majority of people in ICE detention in the US. However, this has been difficult to incorporate into our panel data because there's no direct mapping of Border Patrol sectors to ICE areas of responsibility or even to the counties within Border Patrol sectors. We've tried to get this via FOIA and haven't been able to get it. Also, encounters are not the same thing as apprehensions or arrests. And so these variables we very much like to include in our models, but we've left them out in all the models that we are discussing in our preliminary results today because they don't, the unit of analysis. And you can see, grouping them by border region, the vast majority of Border Patrol encounters are at the southwest border. So turn it back to Maria to talk about how we try to estimate overall detention capacity.
Thanks, Phil. So that was sort of like a description of our 4 data sets. Now, a key challenge for this project has been the operationalization of capacity in a detention center, which, if you recall, is our main explanatory variable, right? We want to know whether shocks or changes in capacity influence immigration enforcement activities. Unfortunately, as Phil already mentioned, only a minority of detention facilities used by ICE have a reported capacity, and these don't hold the majority of detainees. Additionally, changes in capacity are not recorded. Most facilities are used by ICE on an as-needed basis. For example, county jails with intergovernmental agreements that hold people for ICE. And many facilities are also on the books, but are never or rarely used. So what then is a realistic measure for capacity or a proxy for capacity? So our approach relies on the combination of reported capacity where it is known and observed history of the detained population where capacity is as needed. We use this information to generate lower bound and higher bound estimates for capacity. Our lower bound estimate is based on reported ICE capacity for facilities where it is known, and for as needed facilities, the quarterly average detained population. And then we have a higher bound estimate for capacity, which is based on the historic maximum detained population for all of the facilities, both as needed and where it is known. And then we arrive at our indicators for bed space. Bed space is the estimated capacity minus the detained population at the facility. And this could be expressed either as an estimate of available beds or as a percent beds that are used, like this percent bed utilization. And so descriptively, they look like this. This is a figure of capacity and bed space measures for the New Orleans AOR, which, as Phil mentioned too, it has experienced an increase in capacity. And so we have in purple the number of available beds. We have in yellow the total detained population, which is based on the head counts. And then in green, we have our lower bound measure for capacity. And in blue, we have our higher bound measure for capacity, like our historic max. And this other example, the second figure.
Maria, could I butt in and mention a couple of things? One is that if you see the pink shaded area, that's the area for which we have enforcement data. So that's the area we're actually able to model. But we know a bit more about the detention history than we do about enforcement. And then also we're able to spot check some of these calculations against the National Immigrant Justice Center detention facility characteristics data, and are able to validate some of our ADP monthly population measures and bed space utilization for specific facilities, and those look pretty good.
Thanks, Phil. And then this second figure shows Newark, which is one of the AORs where we've actually seen decreased capacity over time. And like Phil mentioned, we have the enforcement data is the shaded area. And same thing, we have in purple our number of available beds. In yellow, we have the total detained based on head count. And then in green, we have our lower bound capacity measure. And then in blue, we have the historic max, so our higher bound estimate for capacity.
Also, a case where we see that there's one of the measures of capacity shows a decrease and the other doesn't. And so at this point, we would zoom in at the facility level and see which facilities are accounting for that change and how that should inform our analysis.
And I think I'll turn it now back to June.
Thank you, Maria. So in this section, I'm going to introduce to you the preliminary modeling we adopt. Mostly, we'd like to identify appropriate statistical approaches to test our hypothesis. And we also like to discuss with you about our preliminary findings from our two-way fixed effect model and difference model results. And we'd also like to invite your feedback and to brainstorm together about the possible next steps. So with our modeling, our dependent variable, as Maria and Phil just introduced, would be the AOR level arrest per 100,000 adult undocumented population. The distribution of this raw variable was highly skewed, so we chose to log transform it. And initial diagnostics also shows a first order autocorrelation process in the time series data. So we chose to control for the lag of this variable in our fixed effect model. And this is a descriptive graph showing the res per undocumented population data, where we can see for some AORs, such as Buffalo and San Diego, they do have a higher levels of arrest, and San Diego has very strong outliers. And this line graph basically tells us the same thing, whereas the purple line represents Buffalo, and the green line with the very high outlier represents San Diego. While it's a little bit difficult to disentangle a clear pattern from all these lines, but we do tell that there's an increase of the level of arrest starting from January 2017, where the Trump administration started, and it slowly decreased a little afterwards. So this also speaks to our expectation about how the data should go. And our independent variables, as Maria just introduced, we have 4 potential candidates for our independent variables, and they are the average detained population, the lower bound capacity measurement, the lower bound bed space measurement, and also the bed space utilization percentage. Note that our dependent variable is on the AOR level, and our independent variable is on the facility level. So we aggregated our facility level independent variables to match the dependent variable. And this is an example of our data structure where our unit of analysis is AOR year month, and log arrest per undocumented population is our outcome variable, and we control for the lag of it in a fixed effect model. And our independent variable is the 4 potential candidates that we just introduced. There are 24 units, so 24 AORs and 45 year month. So when used in the lag pattern, there are 44 periods that we are talking about. And this is a descriptive chart of our main variables of interest, and we put it here just for your reference. And we started with a simple OLS regression by modeling our outcome variable against each of the 4 independent variables without controlling for any of the covariates. As we can see that the correlation mostly go as we expect, where the higher levels of detained population and higher levels of capacity and bed space are all associated with higher levels of arrest, and the higher levels of bed space utilization percentage is associated with a lower level of log arrest per undocumented population. And this is like a good start, but obviously the models will suffer from omitted variable bias, and it doesn't account for the autoregressive pattern that we observed with our outcome variable. So to improve the model fit, we first attempted with this two-way fixed effect model, where we control for unit heterogeneities that stay constant over time, represented by the C sub I term here. And we also control for the time varying bias that stay consistent across the units, which is represented by F sub T here. And we also give you an example of the how we did it in R by using the PLM package. And this is the main results we get from the four models using the two-way fixed effect models. And the results is a little bit mixed, because for two of the independent variables that we checked, the ADP and the lower bound capacity measurement, we do observe a positive relationship, and this goes as we expect, although the magnitudes are really small. But for the two best space measurement, we first noticed that the direction of the coefficients go against our expectation, where the higher level of best space is associated with the lower level of arrest, and also this coefficient for best space measurement is non-significant. And if we account for the possible reverse causality issue here, it is also possible that higher arrest will lead to a lower best space. So that's something we'd like to discuss with you about how to interpret this mixed findings we got from using these four independent variables in the models. And the residuals of these four models look almost stochastic without a clear pattern. But as a recap, like we had mixed findings using different independent variables, and one of them being not significant. The magnitudes are all very small and standard errors are large. We also consider incorporating border patrol encounter data as one of the covariates, but since it doesn't vary across AOR and only change with time, we think it is already absorbed by the AOR fixed effect. And then another approach we looked at was this difference in difference model, where we would define the treatment as our earliest observed facility change in the data. And that includes both a facility opening or a facility closure. And then we define our control group as some AORs that without any observation of a facility change. And we identified 22 pairs of treatment control groups, and for those, for 19 pairs, we found an increase of facility, which we would like to see a positive relationship there. And for 3 facilities and under 2 ARs, we observe a closure of facility, which we would like to expect a negative relationship with our coefficient. And the result of this pairwise difference models are really inconclusive. And of the 22 models that we specifically separately tested on, only around 50 of them, 50% of them are significant. They gave significant coefficients. And for those experienced a increased capacity, which is actually a facility opening, around half of them give a significant coefficient, and another half of them give us positive direction where that go as we expect. And for the 3 facilities that we observe a facility closure and a decreased capacity, only 2 out of the 3 showed us a negative sign that which go as we expect, but only 1 of them is significant. So the results of this pairwise DID models are largely inconclusive, and we cannot draw a convincing conclusion from all these models. So next, I'll turn it back to Phil to introduce to you the ID method with multiple time periods to somehow to improve the model.
Yeah, so the characteristics of the AORs and the data we're working with seem to be challenging for the traditional pairwise difference in difference approach, because the treatments are staggered and take place at different times. Also, areas of responsibility can have multiple treatments, so they can have multiple facility openings. They can have a facility that opens and another that closes, so they can have multiple directions of treatment. They can have pre-treatment, so we only have this small window where we have all the data, but we can see in some facilities, a facility closes right before our window. So there are a bunch of challenges there, and we're looking into some methodology introduced by Callaway and Santana in the difference with multiple time periods in the DID package in our data. And this allows for staggered treatments, and it allows us to compare our treated groups by time period against groups that are either never treated or not yet treated. So we use these same sets of treatment categories for this, but we additionally exclude AORs with possible pre-treatment. We allow for 1 month of anticipation of a closure or opening. As you can see in the case of closures, there's usually a drawdown of population before the closure, which suggests that it's, they're aware that it's happening. And then we're also aware of their like pre-facility checks and things like that that I ought to do that would suggest they anticipate facility opening as well. This approach gives you a average treatment effect per group per time. And this is what this looks like for the increased treatment groups. So the group on the y-axis is the month from 1 to 44 in which the treatment takes place. And so there could be one or multiple AORs that get treated at that time. And then the average treatment effect is on the x-axis. The takeaway here is that almost all of these treatment effects cross the 0. So even though more of them are kind of on the positive side, this is really inconclusive result for the increased treatments. For the decreased treatment groups, we have just 2 AORs, San Francisco and Newark, and the results look a little bit more promising here in terms of showing a negative average treatment effect on the rate of arrests per undocumented population following those closures. And we could get into more details of this, but we're still learning about this methodology as well, and have a lot of questions just broadly about what methods you all would suggest, bringing to bear on this data, questions you would have, about how we've operationalized different variables. We're working towards publishing all of the data and code involved in this project via GitHub, and if there's a lot of interest in that, we can, prioritize that and bring in collaborators for that. We're thinking, about other interesting ways we could subset the data or include different covariates. For example, guaranteed minimum beds at counts at the AOR level seems like a really useful potential variable, and also potentially very useful as a treatment. So facilities that experience an increase in guaranteed minimum beds, what's the potential causal effect of that? And any other methods that might be floating around out there that we should look into. We really thank everyone for your attention, and are excited to hear your feedback, questions, etc.
I'm gonna let you, I'll keep an eye on things here. I don't see any Q&A here. Yep, Scott.
I thought this was really interesting, and appreciate the challenges of working with administrative data that's incomplete. I had maybe 2 questions. One, for the data that's missing or incomplete or reported in a fuzzy way, how much of that is just good old-fashioned government data entry indifference? And how much of that is advantageous to the enforcement mechanisms that are going on? That is, if we don't report things precisely or consistently, that gives us cover in one way or another that allows us to do our job as enforcement mechanisms. So that's one question, just the production of the data and how you think about that with enforcement. And then the second piece, I I would welcome just a little bit more information about the number of facilities and anything. I may have missed it. I was kind of going through the slides while you were talking and looking at things and I may have missed it, but just any information you have about the nature of the facilities, how many there are, how it changes over time. And why that data doesn't exist prior to the window you're looking at.
Sure.
Can I just add, I had a similar, I thought I had maybe missed something too. Because there is a discourse around places needing to fill their beds in order to get money. And to what extent locally, locally managed facilities, not ones that are contracted, but government, public city jails or whatever, whoever, county jails, whatever, that are seeking to get beds in order to make money. And I know that maybe has changed a bit, but I just wanted to know a little bit more about that process in relation to these data, that context in relation to these data.
Sure. So in terms of the enforcement data, that's just been a major headache for us for years and could speculate on why. But the thing that drives me up the wall is that so we have access to a full set of another set of ICE forms for the Seattle area of responsibility, which are I-213 forms, which are generated whenever someone's actually arrested. Every single one of those has a precise arrest location, city, state, port of entry, whatever. Every single one of those has that. Once you get to the level of aggregate data, they claim they don't track that, which is, and they have this, a generic apprehension landmark instead. And it drives me at the wall. It's clear that the data from these forms is ingested in some way into the aggregate statistics that they release because they have the same methods of apprehension are in there, same categories, and we see the use of field office codes in local forms that also appear in the aggregate data, but they claim they don't track precise arrest location. And I do think there's an obfuscation piece there, but that's just.
And does it vary by office or time? Like, do you see more of this over time, or is this like, if you're in Texas, this is just how we roll?
Right. I don't know about over time, but what has disturbed me about it is that it varies so much over place. So like it's less than 1% are these extremely generic things in Seattle or in some other AORs, and up to 47% in others. And so that's why I'm very resistant to saying, okay, anything that says SNA, that's San Antonio City, proper.
Sure.
I think it's the whole region. But looking at that over time would be interesting as well. And in terms of number of facilities there, there's a bunch of other ways we could break that down. I think we just didn't want to put 15 more charts in here. But that is something that would be an important contextual piece to delve into more as we describe in like articles on this. So I don't have like at hand the trends in terms of is it growth in contract detention facilities or intergovernmental agreements, for example, but that data is represented here in the National Integrated Justice Center data in particular. And then when we join that into the detention headcounts, we can see what types of facilities hold this change over time. What is not included is, for example, if a facility expands or changes capacity over time, all the data sets that are out there are just snapshots. So we have like the 2017 snapshot of what capacity was at that time. We know, for example, the Northwest Detention Center has had multiple rounds of expansion, all prior to like 2010. So it's like far outside our model anyways, but there's no government data that captures those trends in capacity over time. And I'm not aware of anyone else who's tracking that. You have to have been sort of tracking snapshots over time and collecting that data. A lot of the like monthly reports on detention that ICE releases now will just be on their website for like 1 month. And if you don't save it then, it's gone the next month and you have to find them FOIA to get it. So that's been sort of the challenge there. Yeah, I apologize for not having more of the facility characteristics stuff in that hand.
I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit more about like what motivated the question, because when I first heard the question, I thought, oh, this is very reasonable, right? Like one is thinking, but now I'm trying to find variation. I guess what I'm curious is, did you observe in some kind of qualitative way something that would suggest that decreased beds means decreased arrests? Then my second question is, in which places or what were AORs did you observe this? And then the third question would be, what do those places have in common that might help us add more variation to come up with stronger conclusions in the quantitative data? So instead of the 15 charts that you're talking about, can we use, these more qualitative assessments to help us narrow down what other variable might affect this relationship?
Yeah, thank you. That's great comment. So as Angelina mentioned, part of the substantive question that advocates came to us with is how do we answer this question about what can we expect to happen if a detention facility is closed? Very anecdotally, they would point to things like a facility in the Bay Area closed and people felt that there was less enforcement in the time period immediately after that. So one of our very next tasks is to look into all of the facilities of interest that we've identified and try to find information about what actually was the change that took place at this facility that we can see in the signal of the data. And I'm really interested about our San Francisco decrease case to see if it is that case that people were talking about. And what kinds of facility closures we would expect to see most closely linked to enforcement. I think that's a great question. And I would say, for example, the big increase in New Orleans doesn't seem to be associated with local increase in arrests. That's not necessarily something that is counterintuitive because New Orleans is more of a national detention, warehousing, and deportation platform, not necessarily local arrests, for example. So we have this, national system.
Can I just ask a
Please.
follow-up? Are you saying that, I don't know, maybe you're not saying this, but are there two different networks? Like I'm thinking about different courts, like different court systems in the United States. Is there a national network of detention centers in which people are moved around in versus a more localized AOR? And would that, if there is a distinction there, would that be a way to better understand variation and cause and effect, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say that is probably, gosh, it's less slides. The over under 72-hour distinction. So facilities that can hold people only under 72 hours are like the point in the pipeline that pushes people into the bigger facilities that hold people for over 72 hours. And there's a big difference. Yeah.
That seems like a really important point.
It's very important. What if you came up with a typology? What if there was a typology of detention centers in which some results apply to this national network versus or this over under? I don't know if there are other types, but that could be really interesting. Okay, go ahead.
Peter has a question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat related. Like, can you talk about the flow of people between detention centers? Like, can I be arrested in Atlanta and then move to New Orleans, or could I be arrested in Atlanta, move to Seattle, right? And that's going to affect your capacity rates. Getting back to Sarah's point about capacity means jobs, it means money flowing to different places, and that's going to affect a lot of these things. So, can you talk about the flow of people between the detentions?
Yeah, and that's one of the major reasons why we think border patrol encounters or apprehensions should be in the model in some way, because people apprehended at the southern border are brought directly to Tacoma. For example, there was a case you see this blue blip here is Yakima County Jail housed 150 Haitian asylum seekers for a month. Those are the kind of things where people can be brought from all around the country to small facilities. Yeah, more comments, please.
So I actually have a question. So for your very detailed Washington, so I think the reason why this is what we do, like try to unpack like what's going on and like figuring out how the data helps you see what's going on or how to use it analytic mechanism. So that's why you're getting a lot of questions more about like what's going on as opposed to how to do the model. But the question I have is on your Washington data, the very detailed data that you said, you know a lot more because you've gotten these Washington records. Do you know where people have come from? Where where they came from? And they went to an under 72 place first, and then they went to someplace else, and then they came to Tacoma? Or like, could you use those data to help you see the potential flow that might be happening in other places?
Yeah, that's a great. Yes, just, it's not quite as specific as direct into like, we do have to actually. We can look into that more. I don't know that we have like all the links in the chain. I mean, people arrested in the Northwest end up at the Northwest Detention Center for sure. I don't know if we necessarily know if they pass through Yakima first, for example. We do have another set of data that shows how people from all over the broader region were passing through Yakima en route to the Northwest Detention Center.
Broad region, meaning the Alaska, Oregon.
Including Idaho and Montana, people picked up there and were brought into Tacoma for Yakima. Yeah.
I feel like the flow data could be really insightful for thinking about the question here.
And the issue is that we don't have full data on the flow. We have, so we can talk about that like qualitatively from what we've observed from other data sets, but our detention records, since they don't have unique identifiers, you can't piece together person moved to the system. But David Hausman and the ACLU just won a court decision saying that government agencies do have to produce unique identifiers in FOIA now when they are like used as a tool to identify people and not personally identified. It'd be so easy for them to just run all A numbers through a hash function and give you that, and it'd be secure. And you could say this person is from one place to another. So hopefully we'll have that data within the next
Putting children together with parents.
Yeah.
Can I rephrase this problem to one, check if I understand it correctly, and then two, maybe it's useful, which is one would assume based on the AORs that we have a good understanding of the population in relationship to the detention center, but actually the population that is being studied is like the denominator has to be the nation because people are moving from X to Y. So while one would imagine by looking at a map that we can hold a certain population constant to study a phenomenon that's happening locally by using the flow data, your intervention might be something, it sounds small, but it actually is actually very big in that this one would make assumptions about the scope conditions that are actually not applicable, that it's a nationwide search. It's about nationwide flows. That's the whole issue, right? And the intervening variable is before and under 72 hours because that says something about distance. Is that right?
You could argue that it says something about distance. But we still want to do enforcement rates per population since those are in a bounded area.
I don't know. I haven't thought about that yet, but I did think about okay, what is it? There's enforcement and then like interactions and then arrests, right? And then people who are what are the three categories?
Encounters, removals, and arrests.
So I guess I was thinking about removals. Removals are deportations. Okay, so maybe not removals. So essentially, where are people? Arrests happen anywhere nationwide. Is that what you meant by enforcement?
Arrests happen anywhere nationwide, but we know at least the area of responsibility where the arrest takes place. So we know that the arrest took place in
So you can
Alaska, Washington, Oregon, right?
and you know where they end up.
Yeah. in
Because you can't connect that data.
Yeah. with our Seattle specific other data set that is not incorporated at all. We have like narratives where you can see someone was picked up somewhere and then it has their, their current address, it's sort of this detention center. That's the kind of thing that we can more qualitatively talk about flows in the region we understand the best.
Do removals, oh, sorry. No, Tiffany, go. Just a clarifying question. Do removals necessarily happen after detention?
Yes,
Okay.
well, not necessarily after detention, but the flow would be an encounter leads to an arrest, leads to some period in detention or not, and then eventually.
But your removals are, it would include everybody who, whether detained or not.
I believe so.
I think it includes expedited removals as well.
Uh,
Which is people that don't necessarily go through like detention.
That's hard.
I think one of the biggest challenges, just thinking about what people have been saying, is that also because all of the detention data is at the facility level, and we're working at the AOR level because that's like the enforcement data that we have, our dependent variable, things like the facility characteristics. Like I think at some point, I feel like we were talking about including some sort of typology for the facilities or number of facilities, but then because we can't, like whatever's happening locally, we have to aggregate to such a big level, like in some cases, like 3 states, right? That we didn't really know how to include the facility characteristics because like AORs are so big, and in some cases, like 1/3 of a state, in some cases 3 states. And so how can we include like those facility characteristics? So if you have ideas on that's also very welcoming.
Something like the average attained population in under 72, average attained population in over 72, and model both of those variables. Maybe.
I'll have Lizzie too. You had a comment, Lizzie and Kyle.
Yeah, mine is kind of on a different topic, but I was curious, just sort of taking a step back. And thinking about like the causal mechanisms that you're considering here with like. A, facility closes and then you might expect to see some sort of. Localized like governmental change in enforcement action. And just thinking about if there would be like, there could be a confounder at the local time level, right? Where like, if there's a change in like political context, that could lead to both a change in enforcement and a change in facility capacity at the same time. So I know that like local level unobservables would be accounted for by your X model, right? But if there's a local change, so I guess I'm just thinking about like, I'm not an economist, but like what might an economist say would be like a threat to validity in your model? And then I think it could be helpful to just think about like in terms of causal mechanisms, what levels of government are responsible for what as a way to focus that discussion. There's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to one thing we've been thinking about is that it wouldn't the theory would be a facility is closed, we no longer have the beds to put people in, so tell the ICE removal agents to stay home this week. We don't have anywhere to put people anyways.
Right.
Or you open a new facility, it has a bunch of beds to fill, get those beds filled, our numbers are low, go out and do stuff in the community. There could be a lag between those decisions, and it's something that we've like tried to build in, like we ran our 2 Avix effect models with like a lagged independent variable, and that was just not very consistent. We weren't sure if it was theoretically the right thing to do either. So that is an open question for us how to deal with that. It's a theoretical lag. And that was one of the reasons why we were, one of the last slides talks about the cross panel lag, which supposedly might be better at that, but we have no idea what that is. So got some reading to do.
Kyle.
Yeah, so Thank you for this. One of the things I appreciate about this is you put together some really rich data. But the richness of the data opens up all kinds of questions about what to do with it, right? And so I think this conversation has been really great. So I have a couple of comments and then a couple of questions, and the questions are related to some of the comments that have already been offered here. So one is, I think you probably have the capacity to think about facilities nested within AORs, right? And so adding another level to your multi-level model might help to accommodate that. And if you use kind of a mixed level model, you can account for the fact that you've got these variations in what those AORs look like. It's going to be complex, but I think you've constructed data that are capable of that. The second comment is you've got this nice time series now. And so I think you have the capacity to think about this reciprocality issue, which I think is going to be thorny when you send this out for review. So your hypothesis is that the existence of a detention center or some change in the detention center leads to enforcement, but you're also recognizing that enforcement might affect what's going on in the detention center. So you've got this reciprocal relationship. You might have to shift to some kind of structural equation modeling strategy in order to do that. But I think you have the right kind of data that provides you with that flexibility. All right, now questions. Sorry for soaking up so much Oz. It's exciting. First of all, you've got this auto-regressive correction. And I wonder what you're thinking of as the social process that leads to this kind of temporal dependency. The dependency of one time observation to the next time observation within these facilities. And then related to that, I'm wondering about spatial proximity effects. So spatial proximity might reflect, just simple political diffusion. It might reflect kind of political context, but it might also reflect these flow dynamics that we're talking about, where places that are in closer, physical proximity to each other might have similar dynamics because you have people being pushed back and forth between them. So the rationale for the auto-regressive correction, and then have you thought about the spatial proximity or the spatial autocorrelation?
So in terms of the autocorrelation in the dependent variable, so that's rates of arrest. What I would imagine is that there's some connection between number of people doing the arrests and the population you're doing the arrests on, that doesn't, we don't have information on number of ICE officers or whatever, but the number of people you're able to arrest 1 month is probably pretty similar to the number of people you're able to arrest the next month. Is that?
I think that's probably true, but I think what you're pointing to are possible social processes too, where there might be momentum built, right? So we arrest this number of people and we develop these kinds of practices, and this is what we do in this area. And so part of that kind of temporal dependency might be just a continuation of these social dynamics that are established in particular places. And if that's the case, then I think that there's a danger in simply treating that as noise and controlling it away. Right. So I'd encourage you to look at what the models look like with and without that temporal autocorrelation and see what you can ascertain about those social processes. You've got limited traction on it, so you'll get little signals, but at least it's better than nothing, right?
And like a related question I have is really when we use a two-way fixed effect model and controlling for the lag of the dependent variable, it seems that the model assumption is actually stricter, and which is kind of extending beyond our level of stats knowledge. And we like to inquire about whether is it really necessary to include a lag term here, given we have already controlled for the fixed effect and we can adjust for the autocorrelation within the error term, and whether this is a standard practice for us to control for the lag of it when doing a dynamic causal modeling with the panel data. Is it something that we're supposed to do, or how do we make a judgment on whether to control for the lag or not?
I'll give a very glib and then let others who work in this area, or maybe Peter knows better too. I think that those are the kinds of things that maybe, and I don't know, are there any economists in this room? But that's what an economist would do, is they just would take care of, and I try to sort of get at the, whatever is the bare minimum, whatever is the likely causal mechanism at work, and to figure out what exactly is its coefficient of effects, but in fact, what you really want to do is think about what Kyle was asking, like, what is the social mechanism at work here? And then in your process of your paper, sort of, allay everybody else's whatever they're gonna lob at you with regards to, lagged fixed effects. But by doing that, you really are, as you say, June, diminishing the possible effects that you're gonna see here.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really not the point of what you're trying to get at with this analysis. So that's my quick and dirty.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so it speaks to the importance of starting simple. Right, and that building your model based on what you think is going on substantively rather than what you think you should do empirically. Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, having both the fixed effects and the temporal lag, June, you're probably right that they're working against each other to a certain extent. The substantive question can probably be revealed better by doing this more mechanical temporal lag. And so you're more likely to pick up that social process that is reflected in the temporal lag if you don't also have a fixed effects in there already. In other words, if you have the fixed effects already and you're adding the temporal lag, what does the temporal lag mean in that? Right.
So would that look like fixed effect for the AOR, but not for time, and include the time lag?
I was wondering if, so part of the question here is, do arrests change when facility capacity changes? But it was really helpful to think about the system that these facilities are embedded within. And so I wondered if it made sense to think about kind of high use AOR regions, if you will, and lower use. So we're receiving people who are detained and arrested in Texas and California, in Washington State. That's different than in Texas and California, where they're not receiving people probably that we detain and arrest, I would imagine, unless there's some family reunification thing that's happening.
Until they go then to the deportation hub where they've spent.
Right, but that's not what but you're not capturing that element of the facility capacity, right?
We are, yeah, they would be part of the detained population for some period of time.
So that actually, that's interesting. So then it raises the question on what capacity means if people are moving through these spaces, and it suggests there's a lot more of a supply chain kind of, if you will, kind of model happening here where they're figuring out kind of where to, it doesn't really matter where people are to them until they're deported.
The guaranteed minimum beds.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so I was just puzzling through whether there was some way to think about kind of more places that do this work with more acuity or more intensity versus other places. The other thing I wondered is, the story that once we remove bed capacity, ICE officials in those places don't have anything to do. So they're just hanging out at the coffee shop or something. But actually, one way you could actually look at that through your encounter data. Do encounters change? Right. So because we know that a large part of this system is about harassment and about monitoring and surveillance. And so if the surveillance doesn't change, that would tell you something about the processes here. Because I imagine there's a bar you have to reach for an arrest, and some of those are going to be raids that are organized and kind of occur more systematically, and some may be an encounter that raises to a certain level. But you have a lot more variation in your encounters than you do in your arrests.
Yeah, there are places where we feel like there's dragnet enforcement happening that's not happening else, like New York. Miami, Los Angeles have these super high rates of encounters.
Anyway, I'm just trying to think about what else you might see in your data that would help you think about what is happening that would be suggestive of either change in practice or change in engagement. But I don't, again, I offer this as a friend. I mean, I think it's really interesting and really, really important. So I just offer this as a friendly suggestion.
Yeah.
To just piggyback off of that. My first, well, when you're talking is, what if theoretically, when you're trying to think about what is capacity, you also take into consideration capacity in terms not of just beds or the institutions, but of the people who are doing the enforcements and the arrests. And if you do that, then you can capture all of it under the umbrella of capacity. And that might be able to capture the supply chain or even, I don't want to call it feedback, but like downstream effects, let's say.
Yes, we don't have information on like number of ERO enforcement removal officers, for example. And others in literature have simply used the undocumented population as a proxy for that, just with the idea that more undocumented people there, they would staff up more. I don't know. I don't like that assumption, but
I suppose like what I would want to say to that is I actually think it's a contribution to just put these things. I mean, it's different paper and it doesn't speak to your questions about this paper, but that is in and of itself a contribution to get us to even think about this question in this way. So if going back to what originally motivated your question, people want to know if there are less beds, what does that mean? If you can find data or insights that suggest that actually that means that surveillance goes up, even though arrests might go down and it might have these other effects, that is an answer to the question that is interesting and important.
so it could look like rate of encounters as outcome with like rate of arrests as a covariate and capacity.
It doesn't, like, looking at this table that you have up here, it's not entirely, arrests and encounters are not exactly correlated.
No.
So
Which might be a
that's
really
quite
Story
interesting.
about capacity.
Yeah.
right? So those places that are capacity restricted, they might do more encounters,
They
but
actually-
fewer detentions, right?
Yeah.
New York City AOR is like, has chronic overcapacity in their facilities, but they have a high rate of encounters. So
I second this recommendation to look at multiple outcomes. For sure.
The rate of arrests is a share.
So with that note, we're out of time. So thanks for joining us and enjoy the next meeting.
well, yeah, and so please reach out to us if you have any other thoughts or questions or want to take a look at the data. We're working on public on that, but like collaborators sooner rather than later. And maybe we get close to workshop or something. Thank you.
Thank you so